Hello, Renegade marketers. If this is your first time, welcome. And if you're a regular listener, welcome back. You're about to listen to a career huddle where our flocking awesome community, CMO Huddles, get exclusive access to the authors of some of the world's best-selling business books. Michael Watkins joins us to share insights from his book, The First 90 Days. It was an unbelievable treat to be able to sit down and chat with Michael about a book that I believe is crucial reading for any CMO entering a new role. We're looking forward to having Michael back on another bonus huddle in a few months to talk about his new book, The 6 Disciplines of Strategic Thinking. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. You'll be supporting our quest to be the #1 B2B marketing podcast. All right, let's dive in. I'm thrilled to be speaking with Michael Watkins, author of The First 90 Days. If you have not read this book, what are you waiting for? Michael is the founder of Genesis Advisors Group and the author of multiple books, including The First 90 Days, a Bible for professionals starting a new role. The first edition of The First 90 Days was published in 2003, jumped to the bestseller list shortly thereafter, and since has been recognized as one of the top business books of all time. Now, a lot has changed in the last 21 years since Michael wrote the first edition. And even with the advent of AI and work from home and pandemic and all that, I would still argue every page of this book is pure gold. So I reread it over the weekends. Anyway, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. How are you and where are you this fine day?
Well, I'm delighted to be able to be with you. And I live just outside of Zurich in Switzerland, which is where I'm coming from today. But it's a cold, rainy day in Zurich. So I'm delighted for the opportunity to create a little conversational sunshine.
Awesome. All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for spending part of your early evening with us. And just in case they have to leave early or we need to convince them to stay, can you sort of, all the years you've had living with this, give us 3 things executives typically get wrong when approaching their first 90 days, and then we'll go through them one at a time.
So it's interesting you ask, right? Because the very, very first research I did on transitions back in the early Paleozoic era, right? I also joke I was like in my late teens when I wrote the first edition of The First 90 Days.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, was actually about common traps that leaders fall into, right? Because I think what interested me in the subject originally was really the fact that people seem to make the same mistakes over and over again, right? So that was coming from interviews I was doing and discussions I was having. And so I went in and did a research project on common traps into which new leaders fall. Um, the most common trap, the biggest one is, the what got you here won't get you there trap, right? So it's Marshall Goldsmith's, cut on that particular issue. What I basically said about it at the time was expecting that what has made you successful in previous roles is going to make you successful in your new role. And it's not that a lot of it isn't still relevant. Much of it may be, right? But you sometimes hit these sort of breakpoint transitions, going to enterprise leadership as an example, becoming a manager for the first time as an example, right? Where there really are these big shifts in what you need to do to be successful. And so, I always talk to my clients about what's the adaptive challenge you face, right? What's the work you need to do to build the capabilities to be successful in this role? And what do you need to give up that you may love to do and be very good at doing? And what do you need to do more of that you may not be that great at or may not enjoy doing? What do you need to let go of? What do you need to embrace? That's kind of number one.
Yeah,
The-
and that
yeah, good.
encompasses a lot. There's so many thoughts that we'll get to later on. I guess before we go back to this first one, were there 2 others?
The second one is kind of related, although a little different, which is reaching conclusions too quickly about the nature of the problem and shifting too quickly from the learning and connecting to the deciding and acting
Yeah.
process. And the third one, and again, these are all somewhat related to each other, Drew. So, is I call
Sure.
it the action imperative, right? The feeling that you need to take action to prove to them, whoever they are, right, that they made a good choice in putting in the role, that you're, blah, 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 right? There are reasons why you have to make early calls and take early decisions, but you need to make sure that you're not generating the impulse within you to do that because you feel like you need to prove yourself or you're feeling insecure in the role, whatever the reasons.
Awesome. Okay. So let's go through these one at a time because I do think that they are the crux of the issue. We support CMOs in transition to CMO huddles, and we also have obviously a number of CMOs under the gun to start fast. And so this adaptive challenge of recognizing that you may need a different skill set for this job. When for the most part, from a marketing standpoint, they're either building a marketing engine or they're improving one. The bigger challenge, it seems to me, are often in the culture and in
Mm,
this area of assessing the problem. But I want to get
yep.
at this just what got you here did it won't get you there in the context of a marketer.
Yep. So it's a good question, right? And the things you just mentioned also, culture, are also important, especially when you're onboarding. And I'd love to talk about that and going into a new org. So the example I used, Drew, is really, I think what's applicable here would be becoming a CMO, right? And what it means to step up to being on a leadership team, maybe for the first time. And I do a lot of work personally, both, through Genesis Advisors, my consulting company, but also the programs I teach at IMD Business School on stepping up to enterprise leadership and what it means to be an enterprise leader and how you really need to shift from being more of a specialist. And I mean, a CMO is not exactly a specialist, but you're very obviously marketing focused to really, being able to talk and focus and lead across the enterprise as a whole, right? And what does that mean? To be a member of an executive team, to be effective, I talk about wearing the two hats, right? Of representing your function, in this case, marketing effectively, but also being able to take the enterprise-wide perspective. I think there's pieces as you go to more senior levels that are a lot more about building alliances internally and externally. Your focus often shifts more to the outside as you go to senior levels. So I'd put that one up there. I talk a little bit sometimes about what it means to go from being a problem solver to an agenda setter, right? You're now responsible for setting the agenda for the organization as a whole. And a lot of this, by the way, comes out of an article I wrote, which is not in the first 90 days, about the 7 big shifts as you move to enterprise leadership. It's a HBR article I wrote called How Managers Become Leaders. But it's pretty clear that move to, being on an executive team, on a leadership team is a very large move. The other one, I mean, it's not so relevant for you folks unless you're planning to become CEOs, which maybe some of you are. Becoming a CEO for the first time is a really, really big leap. And I love working with first-time CEOs.
So many things to unpack here. We had a big conference last Friday, and Liz Weissman joined us. And I'm not sure if you're
Mm,
familiar with her work, multipliers and impact players, but she talked a lot about this topic of a leader first, a functional person second. And I think that's particularly hard for marketers because they are really good at identifying what the marketing problem is and solving the marketing problem. But at that moment, when you make the shift and become a business person versus a marketer is a huge moment. I want to go back to getting to the conclusion too quickly. And this I've seen a lot. And I'm going to set this
mm,
scenario for you. So CMOs, if 3 years is a common tenure, the one either leaves or is asked to leave, a new one comes in. There's this presumption that everything was done before was wrong. So we got to fix it. And that usually means we got to fix the website, we got to fix the brand, we got to fix the
yep,
story. And often these projects get initiated in the first 90 days when in
yep,
fact there might have been another problem, like a product problem or a service problem. So how do you sort of manage this rush,
yeah.
the action imperative, and making sure you're solving the right problem?
The word that comes to mind immediately is maturity. There is this understandable desire to kind of, in quotes, put your stamp on things. And, but there is this also tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And, I think the fact that people are on 3-year cycles actually doesn't serve organizations particularly well, right? I used to joke that the key is to move faster than your mistakes show up. Um, kind of like a stone skipping across the water, as long as you keep sufficient forward velocity, right? The skipping continues. I mean, I'm joking, obviously, right? But look, I think that, I guarantee you that there's no organization so dismal that they haven't done something right. And often there's a lot of good things, right? And I think that, if you're being mature as a leader about this and really genuinely committed to having an impact and building momentum, you want to be very thoughtful early about discerning what is good and worthy of being preserved and what needs to change, right? And that means a lot of attention to the early diagnostic and connection processes that I think are the engine of every successful transition, and not shortchanging them. And then that connects to some things that I write about in the first 90 days, which is how do you speed up the learning process? Because the faster you get up to speed in the new role, the better. How do you accelerate the process of connecting and building alliances? Because that buys you the time to begin to have an impact. But there's a little triangle I use sometimes, that's, learning and connecting, deciding and acting, reflecting and planning, right? You can imagine the three things, right? And there's a tendency to move very quickly to, deciding and acting and not spend enough time on the learning and connecting and forget about it for the reflecting, piece of it, right? And so just slowing yourself down maybe a little bit. And don't get me wrong, I have clients, I'm sure you do too, where they have to make really tough early calls. The situation demands it. You've got to do something. But as often I see people that feel impelled to do things when they really could have taken a little bit more time.
Well, I think it comes back to what you said earlier. This is a problem they've solved. They know how to solve it. Oh, we have a brand problem. Okay, well, let's fix that. And the truth, it's rarely a brand problem in the sense that it's a design or a color thing. There may be a
Yeah.
reputation issue, there may be an awareness issue, but it's not, new logo, new design, new coat of paint. It's something bigger. But if they've done the rebranding, it's like, oh, great. Or similarly, the new website. So again, we get to this question of there is an action imperative. We talk a lot about, we have this thing called a quick wins checklist, 3 pages long of things that CMOs can do that are quick fixes. But the notion is to buy time, right? And and
Absolutely.
and build a little credibility. And I wonder how much time folks go into in terms of
Yeah,
seeing the
exactly.
alliances in the first 90 days as being so important. Why are building those so important? And again, this is the context of marketing officers.
Mhm. So I guess there's a couple things that come to mind immediately, Drew, when you said this, right? One is the old Mark Twain saying, to a person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? There is a tendency to come into organizations and see the problems you want to see because you know how to solve them, right? And that's really dangerous to do that. I think the second point about early wins is a really good one that you're making. I interviewed the then CEO of CBS years ago, and about how he sort of creates momentum when he comes into a new organization. And he says he would always pick a few really easy, not very consequential things to focus on, right? Because he wanted to convey the impression that he was decisive, but had decided not to decide yet on some key issues, right? So that I thought was always and very connected, I think, to exactly what you're saying, right? And by the way, that points to the critical importance of building momentum, right?
Right.
Transitions are momentum games ultimately, and the question is always how are you going to create momentum? I focus a lot when I talk about leadership these days on energy, right? The core of leadership is about mobilizing and focusing and sustaining the energy of the organization, right? And momentum plays a critical role in your ability to do that. You also got me thinking a little, Drew, about culture, right? The other thing I think people miss sometimes is that culture matters, right? The way you get things done in an organization, even if you think you've got the right technical solution to a problem, it doesn't mean you can implement it successfully in an organization because of the culture of the org. And the capacity of the culture to absorb change is something that I think people sometimes underestimate its importance for sure.
It's so funny as you're talking, I'm thinking of a quote I got and wrote an article on. Oh, here comes the CMO. They're always trying to do too much too fast.
You know,
And the truth is, like in a Silicon Valley company where the culture is fail fast, that's fine. But a lot of companies, and so that's where this culture factor, as you're
Well, and it
describing
connects
it.
to the point you're making about alliances too, right? I mean, if you're really going to have an impact in an organization, you need to be very clear about whose support is make or break for you, right? If you're doing, digital transformation, then, obviously the chief digital officer or the chief information officer are going to be critical allies for what you're trying to do. Are you forging those alliances? Are you clear about whose support is make or break for you, right? And there is this tendency to focus on the technical and not
Right.
the cultural and political as much as you need to.
Right, because the technical, we can just plug something in, take something out. Doesn't seem like there's going to be that much resistance. One of the points you make later in the book that really just hit me in this first 90 days is whatever the things that you decide to take action on, they better be the priorities of your CEO. Right. And in theory, the single most important determinant of a CMO success is their alignment with the CEO.
It's a big duh, right? At some level, right? Which, for anyone taking a new role, getting early wins that matter to your new boss, that's kind of, yeah, absolutely. You should be doing that. Yeah. Now, there's also though this interesting piece that I know you'll resonate to, right? Which is what happens if your CEO is really not right about what needs to happen or hasn't diagnosed the situation accurately, and your job is to kind of, move their mind in the right direction, right? It's not just being a taker of the, instruction set for the org. It's how do you really negotiate success, I call it, right? In the book. Because sometimes, they don't have a full view of what's going on. And maybe they say, look, marketing is a complete disaster. Drew, go in and, do radical surgery, do violence to the organization. And you find actually there's some decent people that just haven't been led well and some reasonable capability. Or, you're there, you need to kind of, realign what's going on. You get it in, it's a complete disaster in progress, right? And you have to so there's this whole process that I think is really critical about gaining alignment around expectations, resources, what is success fundamentally gonna look like.
Well, and that's probably so the situation that you're describing felt so real and visceral to me, and it happens a lot is okay. So the CEO says, here's the problem. And the CMO has a choice. They can either take that at face value and go try to solve for that, or they can do their homework and say, you're part right, and or ultimately find out they're completely wrong, and in that spectrum lies some challenges,
Absolutely.
right? And
Well,
and
and that's
so
but that's also where alliances become very important, right? Because, I mean, again, I have my little aphorisms about this, Drew, and one is you never want to be the sole source of pain in an organization, right? You never want to be the one that's the sole source of discomfort. You want to syndicate. So it gets again to how you educate, how you build alliances. So it's not just you telling the CEO, that it needs to go this way. It's you and the COO and the
right.
CFO aligned around, what needs to happen, right?
Well, and I think that in that particular case, it's the marketing and the salesperson, and it's marketing and the CFO, because between those two, you've covered it, unless it's an HR issue. But I love that you
Exactly.
don't want to be the sole source of pain. So it's funny, this came up in a huddle literally yesterday, and the CEO has rushed a new product out to market. The market wasn't ready for it, and now the CEO wants to meet every day. This is not a first 90 days problem, but it could be.
It absolutely could be, right? But it is a form of transition problem, right? And
Right.
you've got to think about how to lead through that particular crisis, basically, right? But crisis is a form of transition, Drew, and so many of the principles are applicable, right? How are you going to get some early wins, right? How are you going to begin to build momentum in the direction of a solution to that particular issue? I think is it's undoubtedly a bias on my part, but I think everything important happens in 90-day increments, Drew, right? There is no other duration of time that's relevant. That's a joke, obviously, right? But in a crisis, thinking about
Right.
what's our next 90-day plan, right, is
Right.
not a bad way to think about what you're doing.
Right. But I'm even thinking of that situation that we just described. Had that individual been able to go to a product person, a salesperson, and maybe a customer service person and said, "Here's the thing. This thing isn't sticking. Any thoughts? Can we come together to help the CEO understand it?" The 90-day increment is so interesting in business to business because sales cycles are used maybe if they were 6 to 9 months, a year, 2 years ago, they're now 12 to 18 months. And so not a sale does not happen in 90 days. The beginning of something that can help solve a problem that will help you get to a sale can happen. And so you have this lagging success. We
Yep.
implement something today and we feel that success a year ago. Where that sort of messes with my mind in your framework of 90
Yeah.
days.
Well, let me push you back on that a little bit,
Okay.
right? So I've been working lately on a on a version of this that I is about managing your organization on 90-day cycles, basically, right? And we moved personally to that system in my consulting company, Genesis, right? We now do everything on a 90-day sprint cycle, right? So we adapted some of the agile principles, not the whole agile implementation, but the idea of doing things on a 90-day basis and combining it with OKRs, right? Objectives and key results
Sure.
and key initiatives and, sprint drivers for key initiatives. And, if you think about it that way, right, you're basically running things and adapting things on a 90-day to 90-day, quarter to quarter basis, right?
Mhm.
And that's incredibly powerful thing to do, right? Now, you're not going to accomplish all you want in a single 90-day sprint, right? But
Right.
you're going to make enough progress and then you're going to reset, renew, think about the next one, right? We personally found that by doing it on a 90-day momentum cycle like this, we've really energized the organization. And we did this because annual planning just was not cutting it for us anymore. Things were changing too fast, right? The environment was too turbulent, right? And so I sat down with my team and we started brainstorming, saying, well, you know, isn't every quarter the next 90 days? And couldn't we apply some of the principles of this to really start to accelerate our responsiveness as an organization? And it's worked extremely well. And I actually have written an article recently. It's up on LinkedIn, on my newsletter on LinkedIn, The Leading Edge, that's about the momentum process if folks are interested.
It sounds a little bit like EOS, Entrepreneur's
Yep.
Operating System. And the great thing about that is from a management standpoint, teams can sort of relate to 90 days. We got this, we got our rocks. If we are all focused on that, it makes
Yep.
sense.
Traction, also, if you like the traction system, there's
Yep.
different. You're right. Yeah. I mean, for us, we've created something. I think it's fairly simple, right? It's organized around OKRs. And we use a sort of, responsibility accountability matrix, and we think about key initiatives and who's driving key initiatives. And so it's a kind of a simplified version. But again, I don't want to get us off track here. But if folks
Right.
are interested, if you go to my LinkedIn site,
Perfect. No, we'll
you'll find
find
this
those
thing
and
called
we'll
momentum.
we'll include those in the show notes and get those off to the community. I want to go back
Super.
to it feels like everything comes down to this assessment period where you're making sure you're not solving the problems you know how to solve, but solving the problems that matter to the organization that are going to have a meaningful impact on it. And yet, over and over again, from your research that this doesn't happen.
Right.
And so,
Well, I think I challenged that a little bit, right?
okay,
I think that folks have gotten somewhat better at doing this, and I think I've had an impact in terms of that, right? I think I've had a positive impact in emphasizing the importance of being able to do that early assessment. I think part of the reason why I've had an impact though is I've convinced people that they can actually do it fairly quickly. So if you focus on, accelerated learning, accelerated connecting, then you can kind of convince people, I think, that it's okay to spend some time doing that, right? It's kind of a little bit of a parlor trick, I guess, right, to do that. But it does seem to work. The other thing I've tried to do too on this, Drew, which I think is working, and I've got an article that hopefully looks like it's going to come out in the March, April issue of Harvard Business Review, is about what you do in the next 90 days. So I've written a ton about the first 90 days, obviously, right? But very little's been written about, okay, now what? Right. The truth is, and it doesn't happen exactly at 90 days, obviously,
right.
right? There really is a mode shift from something that looks a lot like learning and connecting and diagnosing and obviously not only because there's decisions you need to make, right, to a much more active kind of mode. And, for the sake of explanation, I've set it up as kind of the first 90 days, the next 90 days. The reality is, it's never that clean, and it never happens precisely on a 90-day mark, right?
Right.
But, as an example, for your vision and strategy, often you're coming in, you're reviewing the financials, you're reviewing the strategies, you're evaluating the current strategy and its alignment. But then at some point, you're defining what your new strategy and vision is going to be, which hopefully, as you go with your point earlier, is not a completely brand new throw everything away, but you're shifting, right? And you're shifting in the direction of putting some stakes in the ground. You're shifting in the direction of making some key decisions. You're shifting in terms of now aligning stakeholders around the direction that you want to go. And I sort of look at those kinds of dimensions, right? Your vision, your strategy, what changes, your stakeholders, what changes, the teamwork you do, right? A lot of the early work you do, with your team is very much assessment and planning oriented, right? I mean, when I work with my clients, a lot of the time we spend up front is really around team assessment, but also putting together a team evolution plan, right? How are you going to evolve this team to be the team that you need it to be?
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. This show is brought to you by CMO Huddles, the only marketing community dedicated to B2B greatness and that donates 1% of revenue to the Global Penguin Society. Why? Well, it turns out that B2B CMOs and penguins have a lot in common. Both are highly curious and remarkable problem solvers. Both prevail in harsh environments by working together with peers, and both are remarkably mediagenic. And just as a group of penguins is called a huddle, our community of over 300 B2B marketing leaders huddle together to gain confidence, colleagues, and coverage. If you're a B2B CMO, why not dive into CMO Huddles by registering for our free starter program on cmohuddles.com. Hope to see you in a huddle soon. I want to plant a seed for, I know a number of the folks that are listening right now on the call, you've implemented the first 90 days. I want you to think about a challenge that you've run into in that 90 days. And if you come up with a question, I hit this roadblock, I would love to have you come on and ask Michael the question while you're thinking about that. And I'll know you're doing it because you'll raise your hand virtually. But one of the things, look, everybody does SWOTs. It's such a nice little easy formula. There are folks who argue that they are ridiculous tools because they're based on somebody's perspective. They're not scientific, that they often are misleading. But you have one interesting perspective on that is we got to switch. We're starting backwards. Talk about SWOT versus toes.
Yeah, sure. Toes. So look, the original tool SWOT came out of, Stanford in the 60s. And originally they used SWOT and toes interchangeably, right? But they converged, these kind of conventional usage converged on SWOT. I think because it sounds cool and toes sounds like you're playing with your feet. And so I think that's my theory about why it worked that way. But,
better branding.
When I started using the tool, and by the way, I it is a simple tool. But if you think it's not a helpful tool, you're missing the point about what you're trying to do, right? What you're trying to do with many of these things is gain alignment around the situation, right? When I work with, the teams I work with, one of the first things I focus on is, do you have a shared view of reality, right? Are you fundamentally on the same page about reality? Or are there divergent views of reality? Or are you engaged collectively in magical thinking, right? You've kind of gone off into some weird place where lambs lie down with lions and goodness and niceness, prevails in the world, right? But this whole thing about if you don't have a shared view of reality as a leadership team, you're not in a good place from the get-go, right? Using SWOT or toes or some version of it is a great way to just sort of pressure test, right? Quickly, very quickly. Are we on the same page, right? And so when I use it with leadership teams, I set it up as a little survey on SurveyMonkey, what are the biggest strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats? And then I compile it and I feed it back, and so here's where you're in agreement, here's where you're not. That typically generates a great alignment conversation that then can take take folks forward, right? And that to me is the key point of it, right? SWOT versus toes, the reason I go with the toes, as much as it sounds super funny, and we all should be playing with our toes, I guess, it is that I think it helps to start by looking externally and saying what are the biggest threats and opportunities that we see in the environment, right? So shift the focus to the outside first, and then say, okay, given those threats and opportunities, what are our strengths and weaknesses, right? I started doing this, Drew, many years ago when I was working with teams, because I found that if you ask teams, what's the organization's strengths, what's its weaknesses, you got this very abstract kind of unfocused, how do you like me so far kind of conversation, right? Whereas if you focus initially on the outside environment and threats and opportunities, you got a very focused conversation about how people were seeing things. And that's why I sort of went the direction I did with this. I should say too, one of the frameworks in the book that I think folks have resonated quite a lot with is the STARS framework, right? For startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, sustaining success, as a way of diagnosing the kinds of challenges or the mix you're up against. It's also a great little framework to pressure test whether your team is on the same page in terms of reality, right? You see something as a turnaround, I see it as a realignment, someone else sees it as accelerating growth. Well, why? And how do we gain alignment on the core of what the nature of the change challenge is that we're faced with? And so just a couple of simple tools like this can very quickly help you pressure test the degree of alignment on the team about reality. And that's, I find hugely valuable.
Yeah. I want to go back to something because I thought this was such an interesting idea, and I've never actually heard a CMO talk about it this way, which is this notion of getting to break even quickly. Talk a little bit about that. Again, so I mean, the CMO comes in and they're supposed to. There is, and I love the term magical thinking because there is a lot of magical thinking from a CEO to a CMO. It's like I gave you 2 cents, now turn that into $1 billion in revenue. Right? You have no resources and no thing. Off you go.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
put
exactly.
that aside, just this simple notion of how do
Sure.
you, getting to break even.
So the idea of the break-even point, by the way, and that's not the same as breaking the organization, right? That's not what we're talking about, right? It's a metaphor, right? It's financial break-even, right? How quickly are we going to reach a point where we see a net return to the work we're doing, right? I mean, I used it as a way up front in the book to kind of illustrate the value of accelerating the learning process and beginning to take action that has an impact, right? The idea is basically unaided, it may take you 6 months before and again, my little jokes through it, 6 months before you haven't done damage to the organization anymore, right? Where you've created some net value for the organization, right? And if you can condense that, if you can get to the break-even point in 3 months, you've gained a huge amount of time. You've gained the ability to do value creation because that's what you're there to do. Fundamentally, you're there to create value. I again, don't want to get off on tangents, but I've been writing stuff lately about leader amplification systems, right? How do you put in place a system that amplifies your impact as a leader? And that's your team, but it's also your support system, it's your advisors, it's analytics, there's a bunch of different pillars to it. But it all begins with what's your unique value driving proposition, right? What are you uniquely able to do to create value for the org? And if you connect that to the break-even point, right, it's basically how are you going to realize, the potential of that value driving proposition as rapidly as possible.
There's so many questions that I have for you. I'm just going to I give a quote here that I just hope the CMOs will write this down. The question that you can ask who every single department head that you go is, if you were me, what would you focus your attention on?
Yep.
That is such a killer question and such a
Well,
great.
it's part of a set of questions, Drew. So again, I think you're hitting really interesting stuff, right? How do you speed up the process of learning about a team, right? I mean, the question you just gave comes from the chapter about building the team, and it comes from the section in that chapter about how do you speed up the process of assessing a team, yeah? And a very simple thing you can do is ask every member of your team a few basic questions, the same basic questions, right? A template of questions, right? What do you see as our biggest threats? What do you see as our biggest opportunities? What are the resources we have that we could leverage more than we are today? And then that question, right? Which is, if you were me, what would you be focusing on? And I get my clients to sort of do those, interviews basically of the top of their teams using a standard questionnaire template. We often customize it to a degree for the situation. And you very quickly get a sense of, again, how much alignment is there in the team, right? And you also begin to get a sense very quickly of the people on the team. And you very quickly get a sense of, is Drew volunteering information, or is he withholding information, or is he pointing fingers subtly somewhere else? There's a lot of sort of two-level learning that goes on when you do this, but the key is to really begin to mobilize people, right? And to get them feeling energized about what's going on.
These days, it's quite common for companies that you interview with at the CMO level to ask you for your 30, 60, 90-day plan. And they
Yep.
ask, and they want you to come and present it. And yet we have this conflict that we've already described. And I have a quote from you, which is perhaps the most destructive of all. Some new leaders arrive with the answer, right? So we have this, you're supposed to 30, 60, 90.
Yeah.
They're not saying.
So I really hope that when people do
Yeah.
that, they don't think they're going to provide answers, right? Or they're going to provide definitive diagnosis, right? What they should be providing is a process of engagement. They should be saying, here's how I'm going to come in. Here's who I'm going to talk to. Here's how I'm going to accelerate my learning process. Here's how I'm going to build alliances, right? Here's how I'm going to make sure I'm aligned with you, Mr. CEO. Here's when I'm going to come to you, with an assessment and a plan. Here's when we're going to figure out, how to move forward with things. Because those 90-day plans, when you're asked for it before you're even in the thing, should mostly be about the process you're going to use and not about the substance of what you're going to be doing, because you have no clue really in the end exactly what you're going to be doing, right?
Now,
And you just look like a bit of an idiot if you say, in month 3 I will decimate the branding department.
Yeah,
It's
I mean, if you start to put actions, I think what's interesting, I have seen some CMOs do this with success. They say, oh, you want a 30, 60? Great. I need to interview every single member of the executive team. And in
that's
that process, they end up developing some hypotheses. And then when they can present the 30, 60, 90, you say, here are some hypotheses. I don't know if these are right or not, but I want to use the first 30, 60, 90 to sort of, these are part of my investigative and learning to help put together a plan. How's that sound?
Well, so you're onto something I think really interesting and important, right? Which is the power of process and the power of process leadership. I think when you're putting together those hypothetical 90-day plans, they mostly, as I say, should focus on the process of engagement, decision-making, focus, alignment that you're going to pursue, right? Going forward, because you have no clue at this point. I mean, you may have, by the way, you may have a hypothesis, right? I mean, that's fair ball. If you know enough about the org,
Right.
it's fair ball to come in and say, here's a few hypotheses I have about what's going on, but I would be testing those hypotheses, right? And that depends on the degree to which you understand the organization you're coming into, right? But there's also a whole piece, Drew, about you can do a lot by structuring the process for your team, even if you really don't know the organization that well, or you don't know the substance of the situation that well, right? Just by virtue of taking the team through a process of shared diagnosis, right? And framing and solving problems. So I describe this as the power of process leadership, right? And frankly, you almost don't need to know anything about the organization to be able to do that. If you have mastery of process leadership, it takes you a long way, if that makes sense.
It does. I wonder how many people would just say, what's my first 30, 60, 90? Here. And then this is it. This is it. Have you read it? If not, read it and then we'll talk.
Hand out copies. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna give you a commission, Drew, for sure.
Please. Thank you.
Yeah.
Paul Lacey from San Francisco. Paul, what's your question?
Hey, Paul.
Hey, Michael. By the way, great book. Thank you. I've used it in multiple occasions, and it's just been game-changing. But my question is about, right now, a lot of companies are experiencing a lot of rapid change. So speaking about process leadership, a lot of
Yep.
us will come into an organization, and oftentimes within the first 30 to 60 days, I've experienced this, the goalposts change. So,
Yep.
if you design your entire process around, let's say, a particular go-to-market motion and the CEO decrees, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do something completely different. That would obviously change the way that you would have gone through your interview process and your hypotheses. So does that mean that you should change or go back to the beginning and restart the process? How would that work?
So I wouldn't say you have to go right back to the beginning, Paul, but I think you do need to do a reset in a situation like that. I think that would be a moment where I'd be looking at what should I be doing regardless of what's going on? What foundations do I need to put in place? What capabilities do I need to build? And then I'd be looking at, okay, given this shift, what's the pieces that I need to kind of do a reset on? But I think I wouldn't assume everything needs to change. I wouldn't assume that there's big pieces of what you're doing that can't continue. I think it would be I'd want you to be clear about which category those things are in. You may have a fundamental marketing capability that just isn't there, and regardless of what the decision is about, the particular go-to-market strategy, that capability needs to be built. Okay, let's proceed with building that capability, right? But okay, on this piece, we're a bit back to the drawing board, and that's okay. Now, for the pieces you go back to the drawing board on, I'd be really clear again, here's the process we're going to use to do that, right? We're not just going to, snap our fingers and magically pivot, 180 degrees, right? We've got to go through a process to get there. And then when it gets really complicated, I think it's changing so fast again and again and again that you're never catching up. In which case, I think you want to run away screaming from the organization. I'm joking, Paul, but not. If it's really shifting that fast, there's a deeper problem, probably.
JD Dillon of Tygo Energy. JD, what's your question?
Hey, JD.
Hello, Michael. So let's say you're inside the same company. You've been there for quite some time. So you've been there 5 or 6 years, and somebody says, "Hey, Lakshmi, I know you're in marketing. You need to take over product." Often it's because it's broken. It's known. The expectation for action is a lot shorter, and your
Yep.
knowledge should be higher. The process probably remains the same, but accelerated, or
Yeah.
what do you think?
So first of all, I'm smiling at the idea that being in an organization for 5 or 6 years is a long time, JD. It's emblematic of the days we live in, right? That you make that statement, right? So look, I think what you're pointing to, and it's a really great point, right, is if there's precision about the definition of the problem and there's capability to move rapidly to solve the problem, then go for it, right? There's no reason to kind of delay when that's the case, right? It's more when it's not so clear what the problem is, or there isn't alignment around what the problem is, or it requires a new set of capabilities to be built to solve the problem. But no, full speed ahead if that's the situation you're in, as long as you're pretty confident that's what's going on, right? And not assuming that that's what's going on and what's reality is actually something a little bit different. But it's a great example.
Great, thank you.
I
bet.
have so many quotes I just have to squeeze in here. One, and this is not a question because I have another question after, but one of the quotes is, assume the responsibility of building a positive relationship with your boss is 100% your responsibility. Just check mark. I'm putting that in all caps. Another quote that I love: don't confuse knowledge with judgment, which
Right.
is because there are a lot of smart people who we know who make dumb decisions all the time. So-called smart. But I want to go, and this leads into
Thanks,
something
JD.
that will
Thanks,
get
Drew.
to a question, which is another quote: many leaders rely on simplistic fixes to address complicated organizational problems, and they end up committing malpractice. So how do we sort of make sure we're identifying the root causes for poor performance, organizational problems?
So, and it's funny, I think it connects very much to JD's question, right?
Yeah.
It really goes to your confidence that you understand the core of the problem, right? And have the knowledge necessary to solve the problem. And if you do, then yeah, go, as I say, JD, go for it, right? What you don't want to be doing is assuming you understand the problem and assuming you have the solution to the problem when the problem's actually a lot more complicated than it looks, right? And maybe that's because of the culture, maybe it's because of the history of the org, maybe it's because of the stakeholder environment you're operating in, maybe it's because your CEO turns out to be a raving lunatic. I mean, there's varieties of reasons why this can happen, right? And then it's a question of you making judgments about how rapidly you move, how deep you want to go, how do you balance the diagnostic process with the action process. There's real nuance, I think, to it.
And then
Drew,
I
don't
want
know
to
that,
add
but-
in this one thought, which is, I think you have to really be aware of your blind spots more so probably than these other things, because again, we get back to that hammer and that nail thing. And again, you came up as a marketer. You see things in terms of marketing problems, and that could be a really, myopic approach. You're there to solve
Absolutely.
business problems, and marketing is one route towards that.
Like if it really is a nail, hammer away, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a nail, hammer that baby, right? Get the biggest hammer you got and bang away, right? But just be sure it's a nail, and not because you hope it's a nail, you wish it's a nail. That's I guess the key point here.
Yes. Okay. We're getting to the point where we've gathered a lot of information. We need to make decisions. You've got two processes that you described: the consult and decide, and the other is consensus, build consensus. And
Yep.
I'm paraphrasing, but you sort of say it's wrong-headed to just use one of these approaches. Why?
So there's actually, older and deeper work than this about what's the right way to approach decision making in different situations. I mean, I have my little rules of thumb here, and one of them is build sufficient consensus when possible, decide when necessary, right? Now, notice that's not full consensus, because there's no such thing as full consensus on anything. Herman Swope, famous quote, I'll paraphrase it, right? I don't know how to be successful as a leader, but I can tell you how to fail. That's try to please everyone. So I don't think you ever drive for full consensus, but if you can build sufficient consensus on your leadership team, for example, that's a good thing, because you're going to have people bought into, the implementation of the answers, right? But sometimes, you're really in these situations where there's going to be winners and losers. There are sharp edges on what you're doing. You're not going to get people to reach consensus. And it's at some point, you just have to make the call. And yeah, people are going to be mad at you, but honestly, it's better that they're mad at you than they're mad at each other. And so I think just being thoughtful about what's the best way to make this decision or engage in this process, rather than just saying, okay, one size fits all, right? I'm an autocratic leader, I will make the call, or I'm a consensus building leader, I will. No, right? It's situational, like so many things are.
Yeah. And that's, again, we get back to this very sort of almost this mind of a child coming in, being open to make sure that you see the right problem, that you are, approaching the right way of solving the problem. You're building the folks around you in the alliance, so you're not hanging out there all by yourself, and that you're
Exactly.
solving the big issues, which is really, and making sure that you've even identified them. We could talk for a long time, and I know there's a lot of questions, but you have a relatively new book. It came out this year, The Six
do.
Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, which I've yet
Yes.
to read, but I'm hoping that I grab a copy.
Product placement. Marketing
Good.
people appreciate the product placement. Do you
Very
like it? It's
nice.
beautiful, right?
No, we do. Yes. And I'm
I
hoping
just got those today, by the way.
is that right?
Yeah.
Maybe we can get you back next year to talk about that book.
Happy to do it. I'm thinking a lot about strategic thinking these days. I did a presentation for a big US healthcare company today about perspective shifting, right? How do you think about now versus the future, the big picture versus the detail, the short run versus the long run, right? So, and I guess my headline on this, Drew, is given the incredible turbulence we're facing in the environment, strategic thinking has never been more important than it is right now, right?
Yeah.
And then it's sort of how do you do that, and how do you learn to be better at it, which I think is the payoff in the end, because I think you can, right? I mean, there's obviously a piece of this that's about the mental machinery you're born with, but like all great human pursuits, I think that the right experience, right, and the right mental exercise can really make a big difference.
And is this available on audiobook now as well?
It is.
Is it your voice or is it someone else's voice?
It is not. They won't let me do it for my books. I don't understand why. I think I don't have a bad voice, but they always bring in these professional voices that always sound a little robotic to me, but
Yeah, and maybe very soon
it's
they
not a
will be
perfect world.
robotic. But anyway, all right. Well, we are going to get you back. I will get it on my list and we'll be in touch to get you back on the show because there are a lot of follow-up questions that folks have. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question before we wrap up, which is building and implementing a 30, 60, 90, 180 plan is especially important for PE-backed firms that typically are at a realignment stage or an inflection point to drive growth. Has your research over the last decade pointed to any insights specific to managing for success within your first 180 days in a PE-backed environment? And I could just use EBITDA and we'd know it all.
Yeah. So, I think that if you're working for a PE-backed firm, you are lucky in many ways. I would say that. I know that sounds a little shocking, but you've got rational people, focused on wanting to realize economic value, not managing quarter by quarter. They're, I wouldn't say stingy, but they're parsimonious in their resources use, right? Which is not always a bad thing. The best ones will help you build capability now. All right. I see more PE firms that are doing more, not just investing, but actually supporting the growth of companies and helping them create growth platforms and stuff. So I know this sounds a little crazy, but I'm actually kind of a fan of.
Wow. Okay. I would love to have you sit in on some of our conversations. But anyway, if folks wanted to hire your company or you, how do they engage with you?
The best way always is just to connect with me on LinkedIn. I do my own LinkedIn. I respond to folks. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Maybe if you're interested, check out my newsletter, the Leading Edge, which has a bunch of these articles on it if you're interested. But no, please just connect with me.
Awesome. All right. Well, it's such a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're a B2B CMO and you want to hear more conversations like this one, find out if you qualify to join our community of sharing, caring, and daring CMOs at cmohuddles.com. Renegade Marketers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neisser. Hey, that's me. This show is produced by Melissa Caffrey, Laura Parkin, and Ishar Cuevas. The music is by the amazing Burns Twins, and the intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, and learn more about CMO Huddles or my CMO coaching service, please visit renegademarketing.com. I'm your host, Drew Neisser. Until next time, keep those renegade marketing caps on and strong.